How Washington survived the impossible trap, the Siege of Boston, 1775 to 1776. But here is what nobody tells you about that siege. Washington almost lost everything not to the British cannons or their professional soldiers, but to a crisis brewing inside his own army that he could not see coming. And by the end of this video, you will understand the one psychological weapon that nearly destroyed the Continental Army from within, and how Washington's solution to it changed American military leadership forever. Stay with me, because that revelation is worth your time. If you are one of those people who has always wondered what it actually took to hold a civilian army together during impossible odds, I want to hear about it in the comments. And please, subscribe to Unbroken Regiment if you have not already. We find the stories that history forgot, and there are plenty more to tell. Now, let me set the stage. It is April 1775, and Boston is burning. The battles of Lexington and Concord have just shattered the myth of British invincibility. Colonial militiamen, thousands of them, have emerged from farms and villages and converged on Boston. They are furious, righteous, and absolutely determined. Within weeks, something remarkable has happened. They have surrounded one of the most powerful cities in North America, held by professional British soldiers led by General William Howe. On paper, this should have been a catastrophe. The Continental Army, though it barely deserved that name in 1775, was a mob. These men had never trained together. Half of them were part-time soldiers who had been home 6 months prior, harvesting crops and tending livestock. They did not have a unified chain of command. They had no standard uniforms, no consistent muskets, no real logistics system. The British, by contrast, had 2,000 years of military tradition behind them. They had professional officers, disciplined ranks, and the most powerful navy in the world sitting in Boston Harbor. Yet somehow, over the course of 9 months, George Washington held this army together and forced the British to evacuate. He did it without a single major pitched battle. He did it without any naval support. He did it with an army that was on the verge of dissolving into chaos multiple times. Wait, this part is important, and I need you to pay close attention for just a moment. The real crisis of the Boston siege was not military at all. It was psychological. And if you want to understand the hidden mechanisms that held that army together, the signals and patterns that Washington recognized and exploited to keep his men from mutiny, collapse, or desertion, that full breakdown is in our complete strategic guide on revolutionary leadership. You will find it in the description and pinned to the top of the comments. It is the deep dive that shows you exactly how Washington built command structure from chaos and why the Boston siege became the template for every army that followed. Here is the truth that the textbooks skip. When Washington took command of the Continental Army in June 1775, he inherited an organization that was already cracking apart at the seams. The men who had volunteered in April and May, the ones who rushed to Boston after Lexington, were militia. They had signed up for a short campaign, a few weeks at most. They expected to beat back the British and go home. That was the plan in their minds. But weeks turned into months. Autumn came, and no one was going home. Winter arrived, and the siege dragged on. The men grew restless. They grew hungry. They got cold. But worse than the physical hardship was something more corrosive. They were starting to question whether any of this made sense. Why were they here? What were they actually trying to accomplish? The British were inside the city, protected by walls and fortifications and the firepower of their warships. The Colonials were outside, on exposed ground, getting nothing but colder and hungrier. There was no grand strategy visible to them. There were no rousing victories to celebrate. There was just waiting. And in that space of uncertainty and discomfort, something dangerous began to grow. Desertion started to tick upward. Not floods of men, not yet, but steady numbers. Soldiers would slip away at night, make their way back to their farms, rejoin their families. Some left notes. Some just vanished. A few were caught. Even fewer were actually punished severely, because Washington faced a brutal political calculus. If he executed a deserter, he might inspire 10 more men to desert out of fear and anger. But if he was too lenient, desertion became contagious. The whole army could unravel. Enlistment contracts were also a problem. Many of the men who had arrived in April had signed up until the end of the year, December 1775. As that date approached and December actually arrived, those soldiers felt their obligation was fulfilled. Some were willing to stay. Many were not. And unlike a modern army, where breaking your contract carries legal consequences, the Continental Army had almost no enforcement mechanism. Washington could not force men to stay. So as the calendar pages turned toward December, the Continental Army faced a crisis. Hundreds, potentially thousands, of men had volunteered with a specific endpoint in mind, and that endpoint was almost here. What would they do when their time was up? Go home, or stay and continue a war that had no end in sight? Washington understood this better than most of his officers. He had been a soldier himself. He knew that loyalty, discipline, and obedience all have limits. Push men too hard without hope of relief, without rest, without any visible progress toward victory, and you do not get heroism, you get mutiny, you get collapse. You get your army dissolving like snow in April. But Washington also understood something that many military men missed. An army is not held together by punishment alone. It is held together by narrative, by purpose, by a story that each man believes in deeply enough to endure hardship. And that story had to change. The soldiers camped outside Boston were not fighting for territory anymore. They were not fighting for profit or plunder or the glory of a distant king. They were fighting for an idea. And ideas, Washington knew, were far more powerful than any fortress wall or ammunition depot. So he began to rewrite the narrative. In his letters, in his general orders, in every communication that reached the men, Washington stopped calling this a rebellion. He started calling it a revolution. He stopped referring to the colonial army as a scattered militia. He began to speak of them as the Continental Army, a legitimate force defending the liberty of a free people. Every word was deliberate. Every phrase was chosen to remind his soldiers that they were not rebels or insurgents, but patriots, guardians of something sacred. It was subtle, but it was genius. Because when a man believes he is fighting for a cause larger than himself, he does not break under siege. He does not steal from his comrades when food runs short. He does not desert, even when the winter is brutal and his family needs him back home. He endures. But narrative alone does not fill an empty belly or stop a fever. Washington needed something else, something that could actually keep his army alive long enough for the narrative to matter. He needed medicine. He needed food that would not spoil. He needed blankets, shoes, gunpowder, and salt to preserve what little meat they had. And in early 1776, all of these things were in desperately short supply. The Continental Congress had promised supplies. They had passed resolutions. They had written letters full of good intentions. But resolutions do not arrive on supply ships. Letters do not warm freezing soldiers. And Congress itself was fragmented, torn between men who wanted to declare independence immediately and men who still held out hope for reconciliation with Britain. Washington could not wait for Philadelphia to make up its mind. He had to act. One of the most critical shortages was salt. In an era before refrigeration, salt was literally the only thing that stood between preserved meat and spoiled provisions. Without it, an army was reduced to eating fresh-killed animals, which could only be hunted so often and could not be stored. Washington learned that a British supply ship, the Nancy, was carrying salt and other provisions in coastal waters to the north. It was lightly guarded. It was, in other words, vulnerable. He could have taken it by force. A small naval expedition, a quick ambush, the ship captured and brought back to Boston. But Washington was thinking several moves ahead. If he openly raided British shipping, he would give Lord Howe, the British commander, an even stronger justification to maintain the blockade, to press harder, to use every weapon in his arsenal to starve the colonists into submission. The move might win a small victory today, but lose the larger campaign tomorrow. Instead, Washington authorized a covert operation. He selected a small team of men, volunteers who understood the risks, and sent them to capture the Nancy and bring it back to American lines. The operation had to be deniable. It had to look like the work of privateers or local militiamen acting on their own initiative, not an official act of the Continental Army. That way, if it failed, or if the British retaliated, Washington could claim he had nothing to do with it. But if it succeeded, the salt would arrive and the army would eat. The raid happened on November 28, 1775. A small group of American sailors and soldiers approached the Nancy in boats under cover of darkness and dense fog. The British crew, expecting no real threat so close to their own fleet, was caught off guard. There was a brief skirmish. No one died, but the ship was taken. The Americans seized over 3 tons of salt, along with medical supplies, gunpowder, and other critical provisions. It was a small victory. But victories, no matter their size, matter. That salt helped feed Washington's army through the winter. Those medical supplies saved lives. And the psychological effect was even more significant. The men saw that their commander could take action, that he was not just waiting passively for Congress to act or for British patience to wear thin. He was fighting. He was finding solutions. But the larger problem remained unsolved. Boston itself was still occupied. The British still held the port. The siege was still a stalemate. By December 1775, the situation had reached a critical point. Washington's officers were restless. His men were suffering. And a new pressure had emerged from an unexpected direction. The British had learned that the colonists might be considering a formal declaration of independence. If that happened, the war would shift from a regional conflict into a full-scale war for supremacy on the North American continent. The British would pour in more troops, more ships, more resources. General Howe would be authorized to wage total war. Washington had to break the stalemate before that happened. He had to do something dramatic enough to shift the momentum of the entire campaign. And he had to do it despite the fact that his men were starving, exhausted, and running dangerously low on ammunition. Before we continue, I need you to pause and really think about this for a moment. What would you do if you were in Washington's position? What would you risk? The complete guide to the hidden tactical decisions that won and lost this siege, the supply chains, the morale calculations, the intelligence networks that Washington built to survive Boston, that is all explained in depth in our Strategic Command Guide, available in the description and pinned in the comments. It covers every decision point, every moment where Washington could have collapsed but did not, and the exact principles he used to manage an army on the edge of mutiny. If you want to understand how leaders actually survive impossible situations, that guide is essential. But for now, let me tell you what Washington decided to do. He made a decision that defied conventional military logic. He decided to seize Dorchester Heights. Dorchester Heights was a ridge of elevated ground to the south and east of Boston. It was not particularly tall, maybe 100 feet above sea level, but that elevation made all the difference. Because from Dorchester Heights, American cannons could command the entire harbor. They could make the British fleet's anchorage untenable. They could force Lord Howe's hand. Either he would have to evacuate Boston immediately, or he would have to assault the heights and try to dislodge the Americans. And that assault would be exactly what Washington needed. Because while Howe was focused on retaking Dorchester Heights, Washington would have time to fortify other defensive positions. He would have time to gather supplies, he would have time to consolidate his control of the region around Boston, but there was a problem. A very serious problem. American scouts reported that the ground around Dorchester Heights was frozen solid. This was actually a temporary advantage because frozen ground is easier to dig in than muddy ground, but it was also a disadvantage because the British would see digging and fortification work happening on the ridge. They would see the Americans building fortifications in real time. And unlike the surprise assault on Bunker Hill the previous summer, where the Americans had managed to complete most of their entrenchments before dawn, the Dorchester Heights operation would have to happen fast, all in a single night, or the British would stop it before it began. Washington needed to occupy and fortify Dorchester Heights in darkness. He needed to move thousands of soldiers, supplies, tools, and materials across frozen ground, over a narrow causeway, and up the ridge, without alerting the British sentries who were watching from Boston. And he needed to do it in such a way that by sunrise, when the British woke up and looked south toward Dorchester Heights, they would see American cannons dug in and ready to fire. It was an audacious plan. It was also the kind of plan that could collapse within minutes if anything went wrong. If the British spotted the movement early, they could send troops to interfere. If the Americans made too much noise, if they moved too slowly, if they could not complete the fortifications before daylight, the operation would fail. And yet, on the night of March 4th, 1776, Washington gave the order. Thousands of American soldiers moved through the darkness. Some were detailed to the causeway crossing, creating a bottleneck that Washington had to manage carefully to avoid chaos. Others carried fascines, bundles of sticks and branches used to stabilize earthworks. Still others carried picks and shovels, ready to dig the moment they reached the ridge. The movement was disciplined, organized, and executed with a precision that would have been impossible if the men did not trust their commander and their officers. And it worked. As dawn broke on March 5th, the British woke to a shock. The heights were fortified. American cannons were in position. The harbor was suddenly, unexpectedly, within range of American fire. For a moment, everything hung in balance. Lord Howe had to decide. Would he attack? Would he abandon Boston? Would he attempt some third option that no one had anticipated? What he chose to do next would determine the fate of the entire siege. Howe understood what had just happened. While his men slept, Washington had moved an entire army into position on terrain that overlooked the British fleet itself. Not only that, the Americans had moved artillery pieces, heavy guns, and supplies. This was not a bluff. This was a prepared military operation executed in near darkness by an army that, by all accounts, should have been starving and broken. The British fleet was trapped, and Howe knew it. If Washington's artillery found the range, the ships would be sitting ducks. The Royal Navy vessels were built for open water combat, not for absorbing fire from fortified positions on high ground. A single well-placed shot could cripple a ship. A barrage could sink half the fleet. And without the fleet, Howe's supply lines were severed. Without supply lines, his army in Boston was finished. Every experienced naval officer knew this, and Howe had plenty of them. The moment those American guns opened fire, the entire British position in Boston would begin to unravel. Howe could not afford to let that happen. He could not afford to lose ships. He could not afford to have his army pinned down by artillery they could not reach. For the British general, the calculus was brutal and clear. He had three choices, and none of them were good. First, he could order an immediate assault on Dorchester Heights, throw his infantry at the American positions, and try to overwhelm them before dawn fully broke. It would be costly. Washington's men were dug in, had artillery support, and held the high ground. Every rule of 18th century warfare said that attacking uphill against fortified positions was suicide. But maybe, just maybe, a full-strength British assault with bayonets could break through before the Americans could consolidate their gains. Second, he could order the fleet to move. Get the ships out of the harbor, sail them to open water where they could maneuver and avoid the American artillery. But that would take time, and moving a naval fleet through narrow, ice-choked channels while under fire was its own catastrophe waiting to happen. Third, and this was the option that must have burned in Howe's mind, he could evacuate Boston entirely. Retreat, abandon the city, leave behind supplies, winter quarters, and weeks of careful military planning. Load the army onto ships and sail for Halifax, or for New York, anywhere but Boston. It would be humiliating. It would be a defeat for the British crown. But it would save the army. It would save the fleet. And in military terms, saving your force to fight another day is sometimes the only intelligent choice. Howe called a council of war. His senior officers filed into the room. Experienced men, all of them. Some had fought in Europe, some had fought in India. They had seen campaigns succeed and fail. They understood the weight of command decisions. And they understood what they were looking at. Their general was about to choose between his pride and his survival. What happened in that room, the exact words spoken, the exact arguments made, history does not record with perfect clarity. But we know the outcome. We know what Howe decided. He would evacuate Boston. The decision was made. The orders went out. Within hours, British soldiers began moving toward the wharves. Officers shouted commands. Regiments formed up. Pack animals were loaded with supplies. Wounded men were carried aboard ships. The orderly retreat of a professional army began, not in panic, but with the kind of grim efficiency that comes from a force that understands it has been outmaneuvered. But before I tell you what happened next, before I explain what came after the British decided to sail away, I need to stop here for a moment and make sure you understand something crucial. Before we continue, I need you to hold this truth in your mind. What you are watching unfold is not just a military maneuver. This is the exact moment when the American Revolution transforms from a desperate struggle for survival into something the British crown cannot ignore or suppress. And this is exactly the kind of turning point moment that our complete guide to the Siege of Boston and the broader strategic blueprint that Washington was building throughout the war digs into with the kind of depth that a YouTube video simply cannot contain. In that guide, available in the description and pinned in the comments, we explore not just what happened at Boston, but how Washington's unconventional thinking, his willingness to take risks that seemed insane to conventional commanders, shaped every major battle that followed. This is a paid resource written by historians who have spent years studying Washington's tactical decisions, and it reveals the patterns, the signals, the precise mechanisms of how Washington thought about siege warfare, fortification placement, and the psychology of forcing your opponent into an impossible choice. If you want to understand not just this siege, but how Washington fought and won, that guide is where the real story lives. Now, let's return to what happened next, because the evacuation was not going to be simple or quick. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of ships and boats, and an American army watching from the heights, waiting to see what would happen. Washington had to make a choice of his own. His men wanted to attack. Some officers were urging him to order the artillery to open fire, to rake the British ships as they sailed, to inflict maximum damage on the retreating force. It would have been satisfying. It would have been emotionally gratifying. The anger and frustration of months of siege would have poured out in cannon fire. But Washington refused. He understood something that most commanders never learn. A retreating enemy that is being allowed to escape is less dangerous than an enemy that is being attacked and has nowhere to go. If he opened fire on those ships, he would only stiffen British resolve. The evacuation might become a fighting withdrawal. His army, still not large enough to overwhelm the British in open combat, might suffer needless casualties. More than that, Washington understood the political reality. He had won. The British were leaving Boston. That was enough. That was everything. Pressing further, attacking the retreating force, might turn a victory into something messier and more complicated. It might give the British an excuse to turn around and fight. And while Washington was confident in his position on the heights, he was not so arrogant as to assume that confidence should turn into recklessness. The evacuation took days. The last British soldiers did not leave Boston until March 17, 1776, nearly a year after the siege had begun. When they sailed away, They took with them supplies, cannons, ammunition, horses, and over 9,000 soldiers and British loyal civilians who feared what an American victory might mean for them. Boston, after months under British occupation, was American again. But what Washington had accomplished went far beyond the recovery of a single city. What he had done was something that most military historians, even those who had watched his campaigns closely, had thought was impossible. He had forced the British Army to evacuate a major position without a pitched battle, without the kind of open-field combat where British discipline and training held every advantage. Instead, he had won through superior positioning, psychological pressure, artillery placement, and the kind of strategic thinking that made his opponent's situation untenable. The news of the British evacuation spread quickly through the colonies. It reached Philadelphia, where Congress was meeting. It reached Virginia, where Thomas Jefferson was writing documents about independence. It reached every town and village from Maine to Georgia. An American army had defeated the British, not through luck, not through surprise, through strategy, discipline, and leadership. For the first time since the Revolution began, ordinary colonists could believe that independence was not just a dream. It was possible. It was real. And that is when everything changed for Washington's reputation and for the Continental Army as a whole. The man who had been questioned, second-guessed, and nearly removed from command had just delivered the first major American victory of the war. The man whose strategy had seemed risky and unconventional had proven that American forces could think their way to victory, not just fight their way through it. But here is the truth that most histories gloss over. Washington knew, even as the British ships sailed away from Boston, that this victory was just the beginning. He knew that Howe and the British Army would return, probably to New York, probably with reinforcements. He knew that the largest, most powerful military force on Earth had not given up. It had merely repositioned. And Washington was right to be cautious. Within weeks, the British fleet arrived in Halifax. Within months, it would sail for New York with an even larger army. The siege of Boston had not ended the war. It had announced that the war would be long, complex, and decided not by who could field the largest army, but by who could think most clearly under impossible pressure. Washington had survived the impossible trap at Boston, and he had done it by refusing to play the game according to the rules that the British expected. He had forced the British general to accept a defeat that was not a military disaster, but was a strategic catastrophe. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning of this video. Washington did not win at Boston because he was the better fighter or the more aggressive commander. He won because he understood that the truest victory sometimes comes not from defeating your enemy in combat, but from making his position so untenable that he chooses to leave. The lesson that Washington learned at Boston, that superior positioning and strategic thinking can overcome raw military power, became the foundation for every major campaign he would fight for the next 7 years. It was a lesson that very few commanders ever truly learn, and it was a lesson that changed the course of American history. But here is the secret I promised you at the beginning of this video, the revelation that separates Washington from every other general of his era. It was not his military genius that saved the colonies at Boston. It was not his tactical brilliance or his superior use of terrain. Those things mattered, yes. But what truly won the siege was something far deeper and far more dangerous to the British crown than any cannon or fortification could ever be. Washington understood that the British were not fighting an army. They were fighting an idea. And once an idea takes root in the hearts of free men, no amount of redcoats or naval superiority can stamp it out. The siege of Boston was never really about the city itself. It was about proving to every man in the Continental Army, and to every colonist watching from their homes, that it was possible to stand against the greatest military power on Earth and live to tell the tale. It was possible to be outmanned, outgunned, and outpositioned, and still refuse to surrender. It was possible to win without fighting. When the British sailed out of Boston Harbor in March of 1776, they did not leave because they had been militarily defeated. They left because they had been strategically outmaneuvered. They left because Washington had proven that the colonial army could not be broken by siege or bombardment or the mere threat of overwhelming force. And that proof, that single moment when the largest naval armada in the world turned and sailed away, rippled through the 13 colonies like lightning striking through a dark sky. Every officer who fought at Boston carried that lesson forward. Every soldier who survived the siege told the story to the next regiment, and every colonist who heard what had happened understood that independence was not a distant dream. It was a possibility that was being written in real time by men who refused to accept that their cause was hopeless. The Siege of Boston taught Washington that a commander's true role is not to win battles through numerical superiority or through the size of his army. It is to win wars through the clarity of his vision and the integrity of his character. It is to hold his ground when every rational calculation says he should retreat. It is to refuse to accept that a position is hopeless, even when the mathematics of warfare suggest otherwise. In the weeks after the British evacuation, Washington received messages from officers across the colonies, from militia commanders in the interior, from merchants and farmers and ordinary citizens. They all said the same thing. We thought it was impossible. We thought the British were unbeatable, but you showed us that they could be driven out. You showed us that courage and positioning and patience could overcome the world's most powerful navy. You showed us that we might actually win this war. What makes Washington's victory at Boston truly revolutionary, and what separates it from the military victories of every other commander of his era, is that he won by understanding the enemy's vulnerability. The British had superior numbers, superior firepower, superior naval power, but they had one critical weakness. They were operating thousands of miles away from home, in territory where they were increasingly surrounded by a population that despised them. Every day the siege continued was a day that the war became harder to justify to the politicians back in London. Every month that passed without a decisive victory was a month that American independence became more real in the minds of the colonists. Washington grasped something that the British commanders never did, that in a war where one side is fighting for survival on its own soil and the other is fighting to maintain control of distant territory, the side that can endure the longest almost always wins. It is not a glamorous truth. It is not the kind of lesson that shows up in military academies or textbooks on strategy, but it is the truth that every successful insurgency has discovered, from Gaul against Rome to Vietnam against France. The side that can outlast its enemy, that can refuse to accept defeat even when the odds are impossible, almost always prevails. Wait, I want to pause here for something important. If you have made it this far through the video, you already understand that military history is not just about battles and dates. It is about the decisions that commanders make under impossible pressure, and about the consequences of those decisions rippling forward through decades and centuries. If you want to understand the deeper patterns of how commanders like Washington think, how they position themselves and their armies, and what separates the generals who get forgotten from the ones who change history, I have created a comprehensive guide, an ebook that goes far deeper into the tactical and strategic principles that Washington employed at Boston and throughout the Revolutionary War. You can find it in the description below and in the pinned comment. It is the place where all of these patterns come together, where you can see exactly how Washington applied each principle at every stage of the siege. It is not free, but it is worth every penny if you want to truly understand what made him different from every other commander of his generation. Now, back to the broader lesson. What Washington proved at Boston in 1775 and 1776 was not just that an untrained, underfunded colonial army could face down the British Empire. He proved something far more significant, that the way you think about a problem, that your fundamental assumptions about what is possible and what is impossible will determine whether you can solve it. The British commanders at Boston came to their positions with a set of assumptions. They assumed that their superior numbers would eventually force the Americans to surrender. They assumed that maintaining control of the city's harbor would give them a decisive advantage. They assumed that the colonial forces would eventually run out of supplies and morale and simply collapse. Every one of these assumptions was reasonable. Every one of them was based on centuries of military precedent and on the overwhelming historical record of how wars were actually won. But Washington did not think in terms of those assumptions. Instead, he thought about the problem differently. What if you could not beat the enemy in direct combat? What if you did not try? What if you instead positioned yourself in a way that made it impossible for him to attack you without suffering catastrophic losses? What if you then simply waited, knowing that the longer the war continued, the weaker his position became? What if you refused to accept the conventional wisdom about what was possible and instead created your own reality? This is the secret that the reference document I mentioned, the ebook guide that goes deep into all of this, really explores. Because the principles that Washington used at Boston are not limited to the Revolutionary War. They apply to every situation where a force is trying to defend the impossible. They apply to business, to politics, to personal challenges, to any situation where you are facing an opponent who appears to have all the advantages. The key insight is this. Washington understood that victory is not determined by the size of your army or the power of your weapons. Victory is determined by your willingness to think differently about the problem. It is determined by your ability to refuse conventional wisdom and create a situation where the enemy's advantages become liabilities. It is determined by your patience, your clarity of vision, and your understanding that sometimes the greatest strategic advantage is simply not doing what your opponent expects you to do. By the time the British sailed away from Boston in March 1776, Washington had accomplished something that no one in London or in the colonies had thought was possible. He had forced the world's greatest military power to abandon one of the most important cities on the North American continent without a decisive battle, without a frontal assault, without any of the conventional markers of military victory that his contemporaries would have recognized. And 4 months later, when the Continental Congress gathered to declare their independence from Britain, they did so not as a desperate, hunted group of rebels hoping against hope that they might somehow survive. They did so as the representatives of a people who had already proven that they could defeat the greatest military power on Earth, or at least force it to recognize that victory in the colonies was going to be far more expensive and far more difficult than anyone in London had anticipated. The Siege of Boston saved the Revolutionary War. It gave the colonies their first major strategic victory. It proved that Washington was the kind of commander who could think differently, who could see possibilities where others saw only impossibilities, and who understood that the greatest victories sometimes come not from overwhelming force, but from patience, positioning, and an unwillingness to accept defeat. So here is your takeaway from this video. The next time you face a situation where you are outnumbered, outgunned, or positioned in a way that seems impossible to overcome, remember Washington at Boston. Remember that your enemy's advantages are not always what they appear to be. Remember that sometimes the greatest strategic move is to refuse to fight on your enemy's terms. And remember that if you can hold your position, maintain your discipline, and outlast the pressure, you might discover that your opponent's position is far more fragile than it seemed from the outside. Your challenge this week is simple. Find one situation in your own life where you have been accepting conventional wisdom about what is possible and what is not. Question that wisdom. Ask yourself whether the assumptions you are working with are really true, or whether they are just inherited assumptions that you have never actually tested. Because that is what Washington did at Boston. He questioned the assumption that superior force always wins. And in questioning that assumption, he changed the course of history. Thank you for watching Unbroken Regiment. This channel exists because we believe that the stories of men like Washington, commanders who faced impossible odds and refused to surrender, deserve to be remembered, honored, and told the way they deserve to be told. If this video resonated with you, please subscribe and leave a comment telling me which moment in this siege changed your perspective on what leadership really means. Hit the like button and make sure to activate that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Because we have many more stories of forgotten heroes to uncover together. These are the men who built America, and their names should never be forgotten.